Hey everyone, today we're discussing the entity and the characters, and which of them were the hardest to take, I suppose. Which of them were risky due to surrounding circumstances, and which it had to do very little to get them into the realm. One thing the entity seems to want is to remain hidden, so I want to look at each character and assess how risky or not each of them being taken is. Starting out with the not very risky characters, Executioner doesn't appear to be a risk. After all, the entity invited him to the realm, and he accepted and views it as his duty. This isn't a risk for the entity both in the realm, or a potential from the outside world. Due to him existing prior in Silent Hill and from James Sunderland's mind, he is maybe the least risky take. Xenomorph being taken isn't that risky either. It was ejected out into space, and would have eventually died. The only bystander is Ripley, but the entity takes her too. So this is maybe one of the cleanest takes, with it quite literally being in the middle of space. Singularity was on the planet of Duvaka with just Gabriel at the end of their lore. There's pretty much no trace left of the entity when it takes them both. If the planet is ever investigated by some other humans, they'll simply see the downfall of the colony and disappearance of Hux and Gabriel to be down to Hux, likely leaving the planet out of fear of Hux's potential. Plague was very close to death when she was taken. She was a little more famous, but she also was taken way back in ancient Babylon, when there's not going to be cameras around and stuff to record a fog or something. Adiris being taken is going to be placed down to her dying of the plague, and probably nothing more, arising no suspicion really. Spirit was literally dying on the ground when she was taken, so it's very little risk for the entity. Even when the Yamaoka estate is investigated, there's likely enough evidence of Rin's father attacking her, and probably some blood and whatnot, meaning there's no reason to look beyond her being murdered. Huntress honestly isn't too risky. She was in a remote-ish location in the Red Forest, and anyone who encountered her was more than likely dead by her hand. The surrounding areas seem to view her as a legend over being real, which makes me think her disappearance makes little difference, and there's no reason to think something supernatural occurred. Hag is a similar deal. She was somewhat of a legend in her village, but that doesn't mean the entity will be blamed for her disappearance, with them not even knowing really what happened in the swamp. There's some remaining clues like Hag's home base in the Pale Rose, but that isn't evidence of entity intervention, just the existence of Hag and her legend being true. Twins are likely not going to be risky either. Victor had been dead for a while before the realm, and Charlotte was out in the woods alone and on the brink of death. She was being hunted, sure, but her disappearance is unlikely going to be put down to the entity, and instead her either dying or still fleeing. The only argument I have against this is Elodie reading about them in a book that she finds. There is record of them, but ultimately I doubt this leads to the entity being exposed in any form. Nemesis isn't really risky at all. He was deployed so Umbrella could get some combat data, and he would have been nuked in Raccoon City had he not been taken. So I don't think this is risky particularly. Umbrella will simply assume it got destroyed. Billy isn't going to be risky at all really. Everyone present for Billy's upbringing was killed by him, so there's no awareness of him really. The people who entered the farm after he took it over were also seemingly killed by him, so there's no trace, making it very low risk for the entity. Sadako is a case where despite her own power, she was essentially saved by the entity, and therefore she doesn't pose a threat to it in any way. In terms of people in the real world, she either cursed and killed them, or they got away like Yuichi. In Yuichi's case though, everyone thinks he's crazy, and he gets shunned by his university for believing Sadako is real, so I don't think her being taken is risky at all. Freddy also isn't too risky. Freddy is powerful out of the realm, but in the realm the entity is able to mold his powers at its own will, altering them in any way it pleases, making it very unlikely that Freddy poses a threat to it in any discernible way. It's also not risky in terms of the real world because Freddy's technically already dead, and no one believed Nancy and Quentin when they were telling people about the Dream Demon. I doubt they believed them about the entity. For both him and Sadako though, there are mentions of supernatural elements, which places them a little higher I think, although very low still in overall risk. Knight being taken is very bold, with it happening in front of an army of people that Knight and his boys are fighting. Despite this, it's the 1300s, so the The ability for people to record this information effectively and potentially pinpoint it on the entity is very low, and therefore I think not very risky. Oni is a similar deal, where he's taken from a stone mill after he begins to bleed out. Despite a bunch of people being around, due to the time it happened in, I don't see it being risky with people unable to record it, for example, and have that information spread quickly. Onto the potentially risky. Bubba's disappearance is likely investigated, but probably isn't going to be put down to something supernatural. If anything, he's going to be assumed either dead or to have run away. Again though, the lack of conclusion for these situations means there's always a chance that someone believes otherwise. A stretch for sure, but potential. Clown is another case of being missing and lacking a conclusion on his whereabouts. Ultimately, he's close to Bubba, I think, and on the lower end of supernatural suspicion, but it's always possible. Myers is on a similar page here. Myers is a more powerful character, but that doesn't necessarily mean he 1. Wants to get out of the realm, and 2, is even able to. If he hadn't been taken, Myers would have ended up back in prison, so I think him being in the realm isn't really an issue for him. There is mild risk, I think, as his disappearance post his Haddonfield spree could be investigated, although I doubt anything comes of it. Skull Merchant is a character who was in a fairly remote location when she was taken, chasing down Talita and Renato. With there being a body left in the forest, and with the disappearance of the siblings too, it's possible this is investigated further. Again, I doubt it causes a discovery of the entity, but a take of 3 people being investigated certainly isn't a good thing either. Wraith is a case where it's risky because of it being an ongoing investigation with no sign of where he went. As we know, a fog was present at his disappearance too, this adds to potential risk because of the theme of fog being present with entity takes. It's not a likely risk, but it's potential. Nurse's disappearance is a little odd more than anything, and she's probably just presumed dead. However, there's a chance there's more investigation put into finding her, and with the mysteriousness of both the Crotus Pren massacre and her disappearance, there's maybe a chance someone considers a supernatural element. Legion is interesting with all 4 of them disappearing. It mentions in their lore too that many of the parents, or people of Ormond presumably, have theories of what happened to them. It's a stretch, but maybe some of those include supernatural interference. And with the fog being present when they were taken, there's maybe potential risk there. Ghostface is risky due to his high profile. He had just exposed himself as the Roseville killer, likely sparking a huge investigation and hunt to find him. Whether this results in a conclusion of supernatural interference is pretty unlikely, and I say that more so than others here, as Ghostface was known to be meticulous and to have done his routine in multiple towns already, meaning if he disappears again, the logical answer is he's back in another town somewhere, which oddly draws suspicion away from the entity, I imagine. Pig is interesting because although she was taken in front of a bunch of people, I actually think she's not that risky. She was in the process of dying when she was taken, with a few others in the room. I do think it'd freak them out, but I don't think they're exactly going to investigate beyond that, or report it to the police or anything, so it ends up being a freaky occurrence that can't be explained. Doctor is a somewhat risky case, mostly because he worked for the CIA. Whilst the wider world is probably unaware that he even did this massacre, or existed, the CIA definitely will, and will want to know where he is when he disappears. Supernatural intervention is not going to be the first thought, but it'll likely be a constant investigation into Herman, with him holding classified information. With some of the survivors' families managing to find the realm, I don't think it's so far-fetched to assume the CIA's focus on finding out what happened to Herman couldn't lead to something that at least points to the entity. Artist is a character who had some degree of fame and notoriety, and so her disappearance will be looked into a bit more than likely. This is especially going to be true when Jone disappears years later in the same place. The potential for fog to be seen, and the CIA to once again look into this due to Jone's connection, could mean that Artist ends up being fairly risky. Onto the definitely risky characters. Deathsinger I want to place as actually a definite risk. He is taken in the midst of a prison riot in Hellshire, where there's probably lots of people around. Not only this, but all these years later when Serena investigates his cell, she also gets taken from it. again with people nearby. There's a decent likelihood that these two and their disappearances could be connected. We know one of Zarina's relatives has managed to enter the realm looking for her, so there's a good chance that Deathslinger also disappearing here could have been a means to help them find out and pinpoint this as the entity to begin with. It's indirect, sure, but I do think Slinger was ultimately a definite risk because of this. It's also worth noting that he becomes a fairly big historical figure, known as Mad Mick, at least within the Hellshire Penitentiary. Trickster is pretty much just a bit riskier because he's so famous. With him murdering the Mighty One board members then disappearing, it's likely it's going to be investigated a lot, especially with Ji-Woon's high profile. Again, whether this results in a conclusion of supernatural interference is unlikely, but the amount of eyes on the situation certainly isn't desirable. As it was in the studios too, it's possible there were cameras and such in the building that could have recorded the incident. Wesker is kind of a similar case to Trickster, where he was somewhat famous in his own way. Chris and Shiva were trying to find him before he enacted his plan for the spread of Ouroboros. If Wesker disappears suddenly, it's probably met with suspicion and a continuous search to find him, with him being highly dangerous. Wesker was in a big facility when taken, so cameras also aren't out of the question here too. Trapper only has some risk, I think, as he's a character who caused what's said to be the worst massacre in modern history. This likely means there's lots written about him, potentially documentaries and stuff too. His disappearance will be a point of interest. Taking into account old Benedict Baker lore too, after Trapper was taken, his town became overcome with a darkness that corrupted the town. All of this could maybe suggest something supernatural like the entity was present. Again, this is old and currently removed lore, but I still think it's interesting. There are eyes on Trapper's disappearance is what I'm saying, and potential for supernatural elements to be discovered. Dredge isn't so much a risk due to people in the real world finding out or witnessing the take, but because Dredge is somewhat unclear on how powerful it is. It's a mysterious being, which is made up mainly of a mysterious black fog, similar to that of the entity. Its ability to absorb things, even in the realm like Maurice, poses the question of how strong it is really. Not as strong as the entity, but potentially something that could grow in strength, something that could become a risky thing to have in the realm. Finally, we have the extremely risky characters. Cenobite is interesting. Now, although it appears Pinhead arrived in the realm and made a conscious choice to stay, it's not entirely clear whether this is the case. It's more a perception from what we know. It's quite possible the entity stole the box on purpose, and likely wants to keep the Cenobites in the realm. Now, Pinhead is powerful it seems, but not as powerful as the entity. What could pose a threat though is the ruler of Pinhead's own realm, which is Leviathan, which I do think could pose a threat. If there comes a point where Pinhead wants to leave and the entity says no, then there's a good chance that Leviathan could get involved. This admittedly though is a lot of ifs. Demogorgon is a similar case. We don't really have any information on how Demo came to be in the realm to begin with, but it's possible that the entity stole or manipulated it into coming. This could anger the Demo overlord, the Mind Flayer, which again maybe not as powerful as the entity, but equally a being you don't want to have as your enemy. I know a lot of people's headcanons for Demo's removal is that the Mind Flayer essentially wanted it back, and maybe even threatened the entity. And personally, I like that. Blight is a character who does have potential risk. I initially wanted to put him fairly low because he was alone in a cave and seemed to have pushed all other people away from him, meaning likely no bystanders or people with knowledge of his whereabouts when he was taken. However, we know that Felix, Pauline Stamper and Nicolas Cage were all able to gain knowledge or see the Dyer Island cave wall where he disappeared directly. Pauline Stamper also seems to be aware that Blight was taken from her, and the specific ritual Blight did to summon the entity, making Blight's take actually quite risky, with it resulting in people in the real world discovering and pinpointing this take on the entity, but also managing to recreate the take and summon the entity itself, which is quite a big deal, I think. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and let me know your thoughts too on how risky each of these characters were to take down below. Thanks, and goodbye.